Joshua chapter 4. And as you're turning there, I was thinking as Brother Josh was singing, if you just know it's God's will, doesn't that, I know sometimes we would rather amend His will, but if you just know you're in the center of His will, that changes it. Nothing else has to change if you just know that. And I think that's what sustained and undergirded many saints of old who went through much more dire and difficult situations and circumstances than we have. And if you're going through some today, I'd encourage you to seek God's will in that and then rest in His provision in your life. Joshua chapter 4, let's stand together if you're able to do so for a moment. We'll read the first 7 verses together. We'll unpack a bit more of the chapter in a moment. But let's begin with Joshua chapter 4 and verse number 1. And it came to pass when all the people were clean passed over Jordan that the Lord spake unto Joshua, saying, Take you 12 men out of the people, out of every tribe of man, and command ye them, saying, Take you hence out of the midst of Jordan, out of the place where the priest's feet stood firm, 12 stones. And you shall carry them over with you, and leave them in the lodging place where you shall lodge this night. And Joshua called the 12 men whom he had prepared of the children of Israel out of every tribe of man, and Joshua said unto them, Pass over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take ye up every man of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel. Notice now verse 6, that this may be a sign among you, that when your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, What mean ye by these stones? Then you shall answer them that the waters of Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, which is when it passed over Jordan, the waters of Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial. Notice that word, for a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. And the children of Israel did so as Joshua commanded, took up 12 stones out of the midst of Jordan, as the Lord spake unto Joshua. So this morning we'll continue our series looking at living in the promised land, which is a picture of the victorious Christian life, specifically by living in the memorial or the memory of promise. Let's pray together. Father, thank you today for the privilege to gather together again on a day like today and to remember who you are and what that means in our lives, what that means in our eternity. And Father, thank you for these who've made it a priority to be here today. Lord, you've put us together in this assembly for a specific purpose. And Lord, it's not just to talk about the future and it's not just to dwell in the present, but it's to remember your goings of old, You're moving and you're working behind the scenes and upon building the foundation of your redemptive plan. And now, Lord, we today are living because of and blessed because of what you've done in the past. I pray, Father, you help us to revisit and renew our confidence in you as we consider what you've done in days gone by. And Lord, then to be able to faithfully pass it on to the next generation. What a high calling, what a defining purpose of why we're still here. And I pray we would leave today more committed to remembering and causing others to remember the name of Jehovah and all that He has done for us. And we'll thank you and praise you for what's accomplished in our time today. In Christ's name, amen. You may be seated. Thank you. We are in the midst of back to school season, and there's an opposite view of that season. For the kids, yesterday we had a bunch of kids to our house for my son Landon's birthday party. And it's always interesting to me the difference between a boy's perspective on school starting and a girl's. Girls who are a bit more socially inclined tend to be ready for school to start, especially if they're not homeschooled. I don't know how you would view that as a girl as a homeschooler, but especially if there's more interaction. Whereas boys, it's let's ride this summer vacation as long as we can. No homework, no yapping from teacher or parent. Did you do your homework? Those kind of things. And it's amazing the difference. There's another little difference, the difference between a parent's mindset and a child's mindset, especially if you send your kids off to school. The parents may be looking forward to that with some level of eagerness. And I don't know if you saw this post online, but there was a picture of a mom in Alabama. And they went back to school, I think, last week, but this is her at the bottom. She's got a glass of OJ, and she's sitting in the pool as they go off to school, and she's enjoying her day at the pool. The picture that we're looking at today here in our text has to do with God almost before He sends them into the promised land. He wants to remind them of some things that they need to have in their mind as they enter this new season. Now, that there is probably where most of us are if your kids have been going to school for a number of years. But do you remember the first day of the first that they went to kindergarten or first grade, or maybe you remember this as a child, it was maybe a little different feel than this picture. And you gave them the talk and you said, remember whose you are and remember what we've taught you, and please don't turn into a heathen in the next 3 or 4 months at school. And we tried to encourage them to remember their training. This morning I want to look at for a few minutes what God reminded the nation of Israel with, that we need to be reminded of to grow in experiencing the victory that He has provided. For the first time in the Hebrews' history for 5 centuries, they've been talking about this land and looking forward to this land, and probably to become almost an abstract concept. And for the first time in 5 centuries, they're in it. They've just crossed the Jordan. And immediately God pumps the brakes and says, hold on, before we do anything with the glories of this land, let's remember, let's commemorate what God has done for you. And so the question today is, how do we embed certain sticky memories in our minds and in our hearts before we get into the thick of claiming the victories that God has promised to us? On your bulletin, you'll notice I've given you a brief outline. Encourage you to use that if that helps you. We also have on YouVersion. Our outline is accessible through that as well. But let's look at today 2 memorial stones that we must erect to keep us grounded as we face the battles and the ultimate victories that God will provide. Number 1, first of all, we need to build up, or we need to erect the stone of divine performance. The stone of divine performance. And if you would, go back to our text and notice a few ways that God wanted to use these tangible stones to remind His people of what He had performed or done for them as found in the text. And you will notice in verse number 6, that these stones were a message. They were a tangible means to doing what? To talking, to sharing. When your children say, "What mean ye?" What is your message? What are you trying to say? This stone provides an opportunity to talk of what God has done. And so I'll give you 2 things that this divine performance stone allows us to do. Number 1, it allows us to perpetuate God's performance. What God has done for generations prior. The other day, someone was talking about athletics, and specifically athletic wear. Have you noticed that athletic wear is now a style? It's not just something you wear when you're getting ready to run or play sport, but it's actually a style. It's how you present yourself. You coordinate with type of brand or color scheme or whatever. And the other day, someone was talking about wearing Nike shorts. And he said, which I assume this guy's a bit exercise challenge as I am, he said, me wearing Nike shorts is kind of like a minivan with racing stripes. I thought that was classic. A lot of us, we put on a good show, but we don't necessarily do what we message. Listen, here it is this morning. What we're trying to commemorate is not philosophy. Here's what God has to just say. Here's His thoughts on the following subject matter. Our message is, here's what God has done. His word is on the move. It's quick, it's powerful, it's effectual, it is doing something. And so we must make sure that we perpetuate what God has done. And when the next generation asks of you, what can God do? What has God done? Are you prepared to answer? And I've found many times the reason we're not seeing new victories being claimed and experienced by the next generation is they don't know even that God can. And by talking of the good old days, it's not to say it can't be done today. It used to be so easy and so amazing what God could do. That provides a baseline of what's possible. It ups the expectation of the next generation. So we need to be faithful to review what God has performed. Notice 2 messages that were perpetuated as found in our text. First of all, look, if you will, at verse number 8. And the children of Israel did so as Joshua commanded. Notice, and took up 12 stones. Notice these next 4 words. Out of the midst of Jordan. Out of the midst. First of all, there is the message that perpetuates to those who were not there when God did it. They put the stones on the other side for those young children who would forget that had crossed the Jordan, or new ones that would be born, and there would be a testimony. These are river rocks. These are from the bed of that river, and here's what God did in this previous generation. I think many times we forget that not everybody knows how good and great our God is. We don't speak of it. We don't share it. We don't show it. We're not testifying it as faithfully as we should. Joshua here in verses 6 to 8 has these dozen men, one from each tribe, and they put the rock upon their shoulder, and then they take it to the bank and they set it down and assemble this reminder of what God had done. Just a thought this morning, why did God have more than one man gather those rocks? Why were there 12? In Scripture, we see over and over that God says that any word should be established with what? 2 or 3 witnesses. And here we have 12 testifying. They were there, they picked up the stone, they stacked it, and this combined testimony led to a witness to the next generation. May I just remind you today, you cannot perpetuate God's performance to those who are not there in your own testimony alone. It's the collective, it's the coordinated witness of fellow believers that convinces the naysayer and testifies that truly God had performed what we say He had performed. Who can you partner with this morning to pass to the next generation God's glorious performance? And then you notice at the end of our text, go to the end of the chapter, verse 21, now they're actually doing what God had commanded them. And He spake unto the children of Israel, saying, when your children shall ask their fathers in times to come, what mean these stones? Then you shall say to your children, know, saying, Israel came out over this Jordan on dry land. And so there is a witness, and Joshua urges the next generation through this testimony. Now what I find striking, and I didn't notice this the first few reads through the chapter, go to verse 23. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of Jordan from before you until you were passed over. Now notice this next phrase found tucked within these 2 commas. This a positive. As the Lord your God did to the Red Sea when He dried up from before us until we were gone over. Here's the thought. Whatever you're commemorating, that's not the beginning of what God has done. It's just another step in His plan. And I love the fact that Joshua, while he's in the midst of commemorating this amazing feat that God had done, he also is building on what he had already known and heard and seen in a previous experience with God. How many years removed? 40 years. And so here's the thought today. If God's working in this world did not start with you, it was going on long before you hit this planet and graced it with your wonderful presence, then probably His performance should be heard long after you're gone. There's a stewardship here. And we're standing upon the shoulders of others, and we're building upon what they have seen God do. Are we letting God move and work in our life, and are we then sharing it with those who will come after? There's a grander narrative. There's a bigger story than just what God is doing in your own time and space. Hold your place there in Joshua chapter 4. Would you go quickly to Psalm 71? And there's a little prayer tucked in the middle of this psalm that is an amazing prayer and a loaded prayer of why we're still here and what our purpose is for God's glory. Psalm 71, and if you would please, verse 18. A friend of mine who pastors in Michigan sent me this verse the other day. He texted to me and he said, wow, what a prayer. And I was struck by it in the context of our study today. Look, if you will, here in Psalm 71 and verse 18. Now also, after he talks about, you taught me in my youth, and I have declared thy wondrous works. Notice now verse 18. Now also when I am old and gray-headed, O God, forsake me not, until I have showed thy strength unto this generation, and thy power to every one that is to come. See, by us passing on to the next generation, we're not just handing it off to the next biological link to the future. We're handing off to them so that it might continue to be propagated for the generations to come. This is so much bigger than us. It's not just about the Jordan we're crossing and the immediate Jericho we're facing. It's about the future and the perpetuation of God can do anything. So may we be faithful to live in the memorial of promise. All right, hold your place there, or go back to where you were holding your place in Joshua 4 and look down at verse 9. And there's a second component of this perpetuation. Man, God has done some great things, and I want to pass it on to others who have yet to see it. And this is a key part of our relationship with God's promises. Look, if you will, now at verse 9. And this is kind of a striking verse. It shows some initiative on Joshua's part. Look at verse 9. So after these men gather the 12 stones, they're now outside of the riverbed, and the Jordan has yet to resume its strength. Verse 9, and Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests which bear the ark of the covenant stood, and they are there unto this day. So you have in verse 8, out of the midst, verse 9, in the midst. And this has to do with those of us who've seen God work, that we also must memorialize what God has done. This isn't about those who weren't there and those who will come after. This is just renewing the mindset and the remembrance in our own heart and mind. In fact, you don't see God telling Joshua to do this. I think Joshua, for his own benefit, as he kind of tried to get his emotions and his mind right to conquer the land and be at the helm, he wanted to memorialize and know that that river, when it came back across that riverbed, that right in that spot, I know where it's at, and there's a remembrance of God's power in my life. I think many of us would do well to go back to some seasons where God has proved himself and just stay there and just let it just soak our soul and renew our strength and vitality and confidence that God is able. This room represents amazing stories and moments where God has proved himself. But if we're not careful, we're letting current events and empty philosophy and trends and data points of our day to define our future, instead of moments, sweet moments we shared with the God of all power. By the way, you'll notice here in this text that Joshua seems to do this himself. He doesn't ask the men to do it. They may have assisted him, but Joshua in his own private moment celebrated and remembered what God had done. One author I was reading used this analogy of how to renew your confidence in the Lord, and he said this. He said, you need to create a trophy room of what God has done. And a trophy for this, God saved my soul. And a trophy for this, the miracle of all miracles. Those of us that have a wife, God gave me a wife or a husband, or God has moved in my life, I have a child, or God has proven himself in some other way. And he said what you need to do is not just put the trophy there, but then go back in and dust it off and read the label at the bottom and remember what God did in that moment. And because the trophy room is dusty and we haven't been in there lately, we look at the current events and can God do and can God prove himself? Remember in your own heart and mind what God has done. David's the perfect example of it. He's standing there and you got all these war guys telling him how to fight Goliath. He even tries on the armor and says, okay, hold on a minute. God was with me with the bear. God was with me with the lion. This guy's nothing. He's defied the armies of the living God. We need to remember, and so before we go forward, we need to go back and renew and remind ourselves of what God has done. By the way, what are they about to face in just a few syllables of conversation between God and Joshua? A great city, right? Jericho. But before they could face Jericho, they had to pause at Jordan and remember and celebrate and commemorate what God had done. I'm always studying and reading on leadership because I desperately need help as a leader. The other day I read a statement that has been working in my heart and I've been thinking on where it applies in my life. Here's the statement. Average leaders focus on what happens next. Extraordinary leaders focus on what happens after what happens next. See, that's the difference. We're remembering what has happened, not just to get us to the next level, but what's beyond that for you. When it's about eternity, when it's about the next generation, when it's bigger than the next 5 minutes, we must pause to remember. And if you're like me, you don't have time to remember. Would you be honest? I don't have time to reflect on God's word and celebrate what he did thousands of years ago. I got a crisis. I got an immediate responsibility. It's wise stewardship when the long view is in view to take time to remember our God and his glories. All right, number 2, if you will, go back to our text now to verse 24. And there's a second thing that happens when we build or we erect this stone of performance, saying, look at what God has done. Number 1, it allows us to perpetuate it beyond our own little life and blip on the radar. Number 2, if you will, look at verse 24. It says that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you might fear the Lord your God forever. Number 2, not only does this stone allow us to perpetuate God's performance, but number 2, it allows us to broadcast it. What is happening now, God is behind this stone, this pile of stones being built, not just so the Israelites and their kids, their little family will remember what God has done, so the whole planet will hear of it. God is always after not just your little nucleus of influence hearing what God has done, but for it to get to the world. And that involves a continual commitment to remembrance, that it might get to every corner and crevice of this planet. Notice two effects when we broadcast this performance of God, when we point the finger at what God has done. First, in verse 24, you notice it says that, that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord. First of all, there is knowledge. There is knowledge. Here's the thought today. If we don't remember what God has done and we don't share what we remember, if it's not a memory in our head, no one else will ever even know it for the first time. We must renew our minds. We must remember what God has done so someone for the first time can know our God, can know what He has done, what He's done through us for His glory and His honor. Knowledge. I love the prayer of Solomon, his prayer of dedication, the temple, as he builds this amazing edifice. And he says that all the people of the earth might know that the Lord is God and there's none else. And so this testimony of God's provision, this testimony of God moving and working in this planet through His people. God wanted not only this memorial to serve as a reminder to the Israelites, but to all the peoples of the earth. That like Rahab, remember back in chapter 2? Rahab had already heard it, and she said, I know He is the God of earth. He's the God of heaven. He's the God, only God, that I should worship and serve. So God wants to get that message out through your own memorial. Who have you shared with lately what God has done? Are you allowing God's glory and grace to be featured in your life to the lost? Now here's a little secret that I have found is helping me see God's promises be more realized in my life. Here's the question I would ask you. Why do you want the victorious Christian life? Why do you want it? And if your answer is anything less, then I want God to show off in my life so others will hear the gospel, receive His grace, experience eternity with Him. You'll miss so much of His fulfilled promises. We become so selfish. If I could just see God do this in my life, then I could have or I would not have. Is your motivation that God could display His glory and power in your life? God especially, I believe, gets behind the individual who doesn't want to be a swamp or just a reservoir that holds on to His promises, but a conduit that others might see it and feel it and touch it and taste it, what God is doing in my life. Just this past spring, I finished up a seminary degree, and without the help of my wife and her saying, you bum, get off the couch, write that paper or whatever, the pep talk I needed for that. It took me several years to finish that degree. But I can tell you the heart behind it is, it was a master's degree in counseling, is I want to use what I've learned to help others. And I've just found in my life, when I make it about me, it's hard to get over the hump on those things. But when I make it about how can this be a help or encouragement to others, there's power there, there's strength there, there's sustaining presence of God on the move in that situation. What is your motivation to see God perform in your life? May it be that others might know your God, might put their faith and trust in Him. All right, there's a second reaction. Notice the end of verse 24. This hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that you might fear the Lord your God forever. In fact, in verse 1, we see this fear first manifested in chapter 5. And it came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites, which were on the side of Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites, which were by the sea, that's basically most of them, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of Jordan from before the children of Israel until we passed over. Notice this, that their heart melted, neither was their spirit in them anymore because of the children of Israel. Number two, when we broadcast God's performance, there's knowledge. And number two, there's, jot this down, fear. There's fear. There's respect when we memorialize what God has done. I have found the world does not like Christians too much. We're mocked. We're the brunt of every joke. We're always marginalized and ridiculed. And I've found often that the motivation behind that is not hate. It's fear. They see God as real and relevant, and someday they'll be accountable to Him, and they see that we have hope for that moment. And it reminds them, I am unsure, I am uncertain, there is fear there. The most dangerous person is not a hateful person. It's a person who's scared, that'll try to pull you under with them. And that fear is often produced in the hearts of those who see God in our lives. And so I think our focus needs to be less upon our enemies. It needs to be more upon God. He'll take care of their response and their position toward us. And you see here in verse 1 that God went before them, and he put into the heart of the Canaanites this fear because of his performance on behalf of the nation of Israel. I found the best thing we can do toward our world that doesn't like Christ, hates Christ, wants to persecute anybody associated with him, is instead of going out there and trying to do something, just saying to God, come here and do something in our midst. Prove yourself. Show yourself. That pushes back against so much of the threats. You can't argue with the power of God. You can't fight with God. Let him be the warrior. Let him be the sovereign. May we simply submit and receive his power in our midst. One author said this: don't face Satan by facing Satan. Face Satan by facing God. Don't obsess yourself with the devil. No need to master in the hierarchy of hell. No need to disentangle the puzzle of principalities. Glance at the devil. Gaze at Christ. Focus on him and remind yourself of how powerful he is and how little and insignificant the resistance is. There was an interesting story in the news this past week. The reason it struck me was that it originated from Zanesville. Any of you ever been in Zanesville? I usually go through Zanesville sometimes on 70 there. And it was a story of a World War II gentleman who had served in the military. And his name was Harold Davis. He was a sergeant from Zanesville. And his family for years has had a letter, the last letter they would have received from the sergeant. And in it, as he was fighting in the Pacific theater of World War II, he said, quote, "I miss you both more," to his parents, "I miss you both more than anything in the world. There's no place like home." That was the last letter they received. On February 1st, 1944, Davis and 10 of his comrades were killed in a plane crash on Mount Kenai in New Guinea. The remains of the crash weren't discovered for another 19 years. And officially for those years, David was listed as missing in action, and then a year later killed in action. In 1963, they found the crash, and because of the way that the crash had occurred, the remains were so mangled and so mixed with what was left of the aircraft that they weren't able to identify the remains. And so they buried all of the remains in Arlington Cemetery and just commemorate all of these men. A few years ago, the family thought that was the end of the story. In fact, 3 years ago or so, the Army, one of the families had called and said they wanted his DNA, one of the descendants of this man. And later, after receiving that sample, the Army officials got back, and here they had found scattered in the crash pattern or path some other remains that had yet to be tested. And here they found one rib cage bone fragment of this man. And just this past week, I think it was last weekend, they buried, his remain, one little segment. And I was just struck by all of that. Think about the effort to go through all of that just to put to rest, I think it was at the feet of his mother, one little fragment of the remains of this man. Was it really about the little bone? No, it was about who he was and his sacrifice and his service. You know why our life matters? And why it matters that we remember God and others remember God because of our life? Not because of our little life, but the big God on display. One author I was reading in reference to this passage, I think this puts it into context. He said this: the Hebrews were couriers of God's covenant to a galaxy of people. Israel was the parchment upon which God's redemption story would be written. The city of Jerusalem, the town of Bethlehem, the sacrifice of the temple, the prophecies of the prophets, all on this land. The Redeemer would be born here, walk here, live his life here. He would soak this dirt with his blood and shake this ground with his resurrection. The book of Joshua isn't about claiming real estate for a dislocated nation. It's about preserving a stage for God's redemptive plan. And that's what God wants to do with your little life and mine. It's a landscape for him to plant and to grow his plan. That makes it a big deal. And so may we erect this stone of what God can do in our lives, demonstrating to others the irrefutable evidence that God is powerful. He's relevant. All right, number 2, if you will, go back to our text now to chapter 5, and notice the second stone that was erected. So the stone, first of all, of divine performance. Number 2, if you will, let's get now to the painful section of our study, beginning in verse 2. At the time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make these sharp knives and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time." And Joshua made him sharp knives and circumcised the children of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. And now we have the awkward part of the chapter that has some great spiritual truth for us this morning. Number 2, we need to erect the stone of divine ownership. Divine ownership. We are God's. He is our Lord. He is in control. The other day I was reading a study that was talking about professional athletes and how they mismanage all the millions that they make. And one of the statistics that was striking to me was this. The article said this: 60% of NBA players, those who are professional basketball players, file for bankruptcy within 5 years of leaving active playing. 5 years. I think a lot of us, we don't know how to manage what God has given to us. And the reason is because when it comes to God's promises, we get them and then we act like we own them. We get to kind of call the shots of what we do with God's power in His presence in our life instead of submitting to the lordship of Christ, submitting to the sovereignty of our God, and allowing Him to own us and to lead us and to guide us. See, for the victorious believer, it's not about being an owner. It's about being owned. Your heart, your mind, your soul, your life, your family, your future, it's owned by the Lord. All right, I'm going to give you a couple of things that we need to do in this area of ownership. Number 1, first of all, we need to reclaim God's ownership. It's not something we run from, it's something we ought to run toward. It's something we need. It's something that fulfills our desires to be owned and ruled by the Lord. And basically what is happening here in chapter 5 is God is restoring His choice. You are my chosen people. I want to be Lord. I want to own the responsibility of taking care of you and providing for you and guiding you. And so there's a reclaiming of this birthright as God's chosen people. I think we've forgotten that in our day. There's something special about our relationship with God that's not known by all people. It's a select thing. It's a special thing. Not that others are ostracized, but there's unique privileges and responsibilities that go with it. And can you imagine, all right, now they're in enemy territory. And I don't want to get too deceived on the logistics of all of this, but probably this was not the best move militarily to do as soon as you cross the Jordan River. It incapacitated the men. It exposed them to great risk as these enemies begin to plan their strategy of attack and defense. And yet God took the time to remind them that He owned them and put that as a priority. We don't have time to break it down, but if you were to go back to Genesis and then in Exodus, this concept of circumcision, it was an identity with God. They were special, they were sanctified, and this had fallen on hard times in the wilderness. In fact, in verses 4 to 7, he explains why this has to be renewed. Did you notice that? And this is the cause why Joshua did circumcise all the people that came out of Egypt that were males, even all the men of war, died in the wilderness, by the way. Now all the people, verse 5, that came out were, but all the people that were born in the wilderness, end of the verse, them they had not circumcised. And so in the wilderness, this had passed away, this tangible reminder that God was their owner. And so God took the time to sanctify them and to restore this ownership that He rightfully deserved. And may I say today, without the fixed stone of divine ownership, we are only one generation away from uncircumcision in the proverbial sense. We must be special. We must be set apart. It involves separating from that which is worldly and being pure in the Lord's sight. Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 to 5 says, "If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. For ye are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall you appear with Him in glory. Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth." You must separate from that which undermines your relationship with the Lord. The other day I was reading an author who was using the analogy of Switzerland. Remember, Switzerland during World War II chose to not pick a side, we're just neutral. The author said this: when it comes to sin, it's kill or be killed. You're fighting the war or you're losing it. There's no Switzerland in sanctification. You have to pick. You want to have all the worldly tunes in your heart and head? You want to have all the empty entertainment and all the hollow things the world crams into their mind? Or do you want to have sanctified memory that allows you to testify to others of what God has done? Let God own your mind. Maybe the last recess you're holding out on him with. Men who should have purity and do not. Ladies who should have purity and do not. Our mind needs to be set apart unto the Lord. When you and I are too busy or too pragmatic to model submission to the Lord, you're opening up your family. I'm opening up my family and this church to the infiltration of the enemy. We must guard our minds. And from that, we can fight from a position of victory. By the way, the enemy, the last thing he wants you to do is remember these promises that purify and sanctify you. Because then he knows you'll never see them fulfilled, and neither will the generation that follows. Be willing to reclaim God's ownership in your life. All right, then if you would, notice the last couple of verses, and I love how this narrative builds to this crescendo. Verse 8. And it came to pass when they had done circumcising all the people that they abode in their places in the camp. Notice this last phrase, till they were whole. Number two, secondly, we need to liberate God's ownership. We need to let Him freely work in our lives. He calls all the shots. He's in charge. There's no struggle for control. We just liberate Him to lead out in our lives. The other day, someone posted this, and I resent this post because I would fall into this category. They said, "Dear friends older than 37, you don't have to put 2 spaces after the period anymore. That was for the typewriter era. You are free." Any of you struggle with that still? I have grappled with that, and I don't have time to get into typesets and things, but there was a reason why we double-spaced after a period. And now grammatically, my wife may take issue with this. She's an English major. But I have been told now you don't have to do that. You can be a rebel, total rebel, and go with just 1 space. I can't bring myself to do that, I got to be honest. Being free of something. How are we free of our emotions that control us and manipulate us? How are we control of bossy people and controlling people in situations? By submitting to the Lord. It's freeing. Can't remember the exact statement, but basically the expression was, the best response to a critic is to ignore them, basically saying your opinion doesn't matter to my life. I think sometimes we value people's opinions too much. It controls us. It directs us. When you submit to the Lord, it's freeing. I have one boss. I have one sovereign. I have one Lord. He's leading me to the promised land. That's all that matters. Who is your sovereign today? It's freeing to let Him be in charge. All right, notice 2 benefits to this liberty that comes when we submit to the Lord. When we just erect this stone, God, you own me, and I will submit to it. First of all, you notice the end of verse 8 as we read, they were whole. Whole. I don't know what today, if I were to say, what would make you whole? What would make you complete? What would make you satisfied and enriched to your wildest imaginations? I found the answer to that often is not by adding something. It's by subtracting or cutting away something that's sucking energy and life and vitality from my day-to-day existence. And so God severed some things and sanctified some things, and the result of that was wholeness. Sometimes our wholeness is not because we have too little, it's we have things that are not necessary, things that weigh us down. Hold your place there in Joshua. Quickly go back to Colossians chapter 2. And just these couple of verses that take this concept of circumcision, an awkward subject to speak about in church, and spiritualize it because it's emphasized even throughout the New Testament in a spiritual sense. Colossians chapter number 2, and if you would please, verse number 9. Colossians chapter 2 and verse 9. And I was planning on just reading verse 11, and then as I was reading the full import and context, it's amazing how the previous couple of verses carry with it this idea of completeness or wholeness. Look, if you will, at verse 11. First, it says this, "In whom also ye are circumcised," or he's writing to New Testament believers, "with circumcision made without hands." So we're talking on a spiritual plane, in putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. And so there is this separation so that we can be made whole. Now go back to the previous 2 verses where it says this, "For in Him," speaking of Christ, "dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily." Now notice verse 10. "And ye are complete in Him, which is the head of all principality and power." Now here's just the thought before we move on. You cannot be whole, you cannot be complete without this circumcision, this cutting away, this separation from that which is not sanctified. In a spiritual sense, we have all been circumcised who know Jesus Christ as Savior. It's a Bible concept. It's a new creation, and to be whole means we must submit to the Lord. And here's just the question this morning. Could it be the biggest thing holding you back from God's promises in your life is not the next thing that He needs to add, but it's the next thing that you already know needs to be separated out of your life? A way of thinking, a relationship, a habit, a certain past thing that you're not dealing with properly. And if you would ever just submit that to the lordship of Jesus Christ, if you would ever let Him be in control of that area, maybe it's a health thing, whatever the specific, and you would let Him be in charge, would it not lead to a wholeness and completeness that only He can provide? All right, lastly, and probably my favorite verse in our text is verse 9. Would you go back to Joshua chapter 5, and let's look at verse number 9. All of this crescendos, the Jordan and the stones erected from it, this procedure done in verses 2 through 7. And then notice, if you will, verse 9, here's what all of this was leading to. And the Lord, all right, now He's Lord, said unto Joshua, This day have I rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off you. Wherefore the name of the place is called Gilgal unto this day. Notice the middle of the verse, This day have I rolled away the reproach of Egypt. This liberty not only leads to a wholeness, but number two, it leads to a rolling away of reproach. A rolling away of reproach. Do you have in your past a picture, a moment in your past captured in picture form that you majorly regret? I do. I have a lot of them. I know that surprises you. One of them is my 7th grade basketball picture. And my wife did a scrapbook a few years ago. I was hoping somehow this picture would not be in there, and it is. And my boys, every time they go through, they get to that and they just start snickering. But it's a picture of me in 7th grade. And you, of course, I've morphed into a very fit specimen before you. But back in 7th grade, I'm being totally facetious. In 7th grade, one of my major anatomical challenges was my biceps were a bit underdeveloped. And there's a picture of me, you know, I don't know if you've ever seen where they have you hold it was a basketball picture, 7th grade, holding a basketball, and you can see my hand holding the basketball, and then it's what is holding the hand, which is holding the arm, which there's just nothing there. And that picture drives me crazy. I don't know if you have an outfit you wore. Some of you go back a little longer than me, further. What were you guys thinking? Okay, that's all I have to say. Some of the things you wore. My dad, the real thick knotted tie with every other plaid and stripe all together, man, he was cool, you know, back in the whatever era that was. It's amazing things we had in the past that we'd like to forget. It's a bit shameful now to open up that photo album. God wants to deal with our past by rolling away the shame that's associated with it. Now, here's the thought. God can't change your past, but He can change how you feel about it, how you view it, and even, what's amazing, oftentimes how others view that. You can talk about it in public and not wince too much as you talk about it. God can change your view of the past. He can roll back the shame, the reproach that's piled on by others when you submit to His lordship. Here's the thought today. We're talking about going back. Here's where I get way off in the weeds, is I go back to what God has done, and then I start looking at all that I did. I dropped the ball there, and then I failed here, and then I did this foolish thing, and I thought this and said this, and very quickly I go from dwelling on what God has done in the past to where I've totally failed, and it becomes very unproductive. God deals with the reproach that had been piled on the nation of Israel. Yep, here come these slaves. Here come these losers. Here come these who were the brunt of every joke and working and building the kingdom of Egypt for free, and the mockery that was piled upon them. And God said, when this procedure is done and you are sanctified to me, that reproach is gone. Romans 6 and verse 11 applies that to us as New Testament believers. Likewise, reckon ye also yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin, but alive unto God through Jesus Christ our what? Lord. When He's Lord, there's freedom. When He is Lord, we are free from the shame of our past. I have said this before, and I say it again because I think I need to hear it, and you may as well. Here's the devil's agenda every time in our lives. Number one is to entice you. Here's the little thing you could enjoy. Here's the little tidbit. Here's the little bait. After you bite, he then enslaves you to what he's enticed you with. And then here's the one that I find holds us back more than the other. Lastly, he wants to then threaten to expose you. So he entices, he enslaves, and then often how he keeps you enslaved. Some of you men battling with thought life, or you ladies, some private issue you're dealing with. What's one of the greatest barriers? I just don't want anybody to know. I don't want the shame that's associated with it. And so he entices, he enslaves, and then he threatens to expose. And the way to get free of that is not to worry about the shame, it's just to submit to the Lord. Let him be Lord, and he will roll back the reproach. He will restore where you have broken your testimony and reputation. May I say today, God's promises are never realized through shame. We touched on that in our parenting a few weeks ago. God's promises are never realized through shame. They are discovered through sin eclipsing grace. The only reason sin is even brought up is just to show how great God's grace is. That's how God works. That's how God thinks. And we need to renew our minds by submitting to that Lord. All right, as we finish today, would you go to Psalm 103? Let's spend just a couple of minutes there, give you a couple closing thoughts. Psalm 103. So what's the takeaway from this man Joshua and these stones being erected? What's that mean in our lives? Psalm 103. And by the way, if God calls you to take a literal stone and carve something on it and prop it up in your backyard or front yard or in your neighbor's yard, I don't know, whatever he leads you to do, I'm okay with that. But I think this has more spiritual implications. And just a couple of thoughts as we finish. Psalm 103, and we'll begin in just a moment in verse number 5. Psalm 103, and we'll begin, in verse number 2. Before we get to that, I was reading an article that was talking about our relationship with Satan and the devil and the resistance that's against us, which I'm sure you feel if you're trying to press into the victory God has given. And there was a little statement out there that struck me. The author said this: Satan has no recourse to your testimony. Satan has no recourse to your testimony. Your best weapon against his attacks is a good memory. A good memory. He can't argue with that. What God has done, he can't argue with that. That's set in stone. That's eternally irrefutable, and he will yield to that. And here in Psalm 103, there's this reminder, David, of blessing the Lord and remembering his goodness. And I give you just a few encouraging verses. You could read the whole psalm on your own time. But let's begin in verse number 2. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Notice that. Not my body, not my voice, my soul, deep within me. And forget not all his benefits, who forgiveth all thine iniquities, who healeth all thy diseases, who redeemeth thy life from destruction, who crowneth thee with loving kindness and tender mercies, who satisfieth thy mouth with good things, so that thy youth is renewed like the eagles. And often if you've had me visit you in a hospital bed or a difficult situation that I really know I have nothing profitable to say, this is a psalm I often read in that kind of a setting. There's just great hope in renewing and remembering God. Go, if you will, down to verse number 10. He had not dealt with us after our sins, nor rewarded us according to our iniquities. For as the heaven is high above the earth, so great is his mercy toward them that fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far hath he removed our transgressions from us. So that's the dealing with the negative parts of our memory. He's not remembering. Why are you? Why are you wasting your time with God, revisiting things he's moved on from? Verse 13, like as a father pitieth his children, so the Lord, notice that, the Lord pitieth them that fear him. And I love verse 14, for he knoweth our frame, talking of just how we're made. He remembereth that we are dust. Whether you remember God and who he is or not, he remembers you. I don't know how he does that with all he's got juggling in his mind, but he remembers you. He thinks on you. He dwells on you. And I'm telling you, if you know Jesus Christ as Savior, he thinks only good thoughts about you. Thoughts that involve promises and projections of where he would like to take and lead you in your life. I want to show you a picture as we finish tonight or this morning, and I mean this not in a melodramatic way at all, but I came across it and there was a heading on it that said, "This is true love." And I think this pictures how God would view things. The top picture is of a young couple prior to this young man serving overseas. And then you can see it's the same young couple a few years later, and you can notice the gentleman there on the right. Don't know much of the backstory on the pictures, but he probably IED or something of that nature. and the scarring from that sacrifice. And the heading underneath that picture was just, "This is true love." It's not surface. And I think the reason that we and God are not on the same page is we're thinking in such tangible ways. God loves you on a heart level. God loves you on a mind level. It's about your soul. It's not about your body. It's not about situations you're going through. And that's really not what it's all about. It's about promises made to your heart, promises made to your soul. It's beyond the immediate. And until we appreciate that, we don't know how much God loves us and what he wants to do through us. And here was the statement. I'd encourage you to jot this down if you're taking notes. This is profound. Here's the statement. If he, speaking of God, if he has loved you once, he will love you forever. God is a forever kind of God. If he's loved you once, he will love you forever. You need to remember that today. And the promises tomorrow are just as loving as the ones today. And the ones today are just as special as the ones yesterday. The last generation, the next generation, his love is transcendent. Remember that. And when we live in the memorial of promise, when we remember his love and care, anything's possible. Anything's possible. May we believe it this morning. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for your word today. Pray, Father, you've stirred in hearts, not just minds.